We have a really important first webinar opportunity for us as partners in the Coram Innovation Incubator. One of our objectives is to innovate, to find new solutions to the challenges, old and new, that we face. And we are all convinced that to do so, we have opportunities as yet unrealised through technological means. But in order to take those opportunities and even to think them through, we really need to have a real understanding of data governance, where it is a challenge, where it is not a challenge or should not be a barrier. And we're absolutely delighted, therefore, to have the expertise within the incubator from Microsoft, who are going to help us to appreciate and think through those issues and to understand where AI technologies may actually be able to assist us in this groundbreaking work that we're looking to do together. So with those few words, I think you've got now we've done our welcomes, we've done our introductions, we are recording so that others who have not been able to come will be able to watch afterwards. So please do let your colleagues know that. And we're going to start by looking at the data governance framework. Helena, you're driving the slides.
Yeah, I'll talk through them if that's okay.
You're going to talk through them, Kenya. Thank you very much indeed.
So hello again, everybody. Really pleased to be here. We got you for the next 90 minutes or so, and we're going to spend a bit of time looking at a high-level overview about how we could effectively govern our data and its role in digital innovation. Then we're going to hand over to Richard, who's going to talk to us about the role of responsible AI. And then finally, Helen and Carol will close and we can outline any next steps. If we go to the next slide, before we kick off, on the next slide, I'd like to invite you to imagine. So imagine if the team around the child could safely and securely collaborate and share information to draw insights. So thinking about your MASH, sharing data with your housing teams, police, health partners, etc. How can you do that safely and securely? Then think about how care professionals could be empowered with the tools and the skills to augment their productivity and enable informed decision making. So thinking about freeing up your front line from some of those more repetitive or low value tasks and actually freeing them up to do more complex or citizen facing work. And then finally, imagine if vulnerable children and families could trust care services to be reliably fair and inclusive. So this isn't kind of a utopia or nirvana that I'm describing. All of this is achievable through some of the principles that we're going to talk through today. And with that in mind, I'm going to hand you over to Chris, who will talk to you about data governance.
Thank you very much. Do you mind if I take control and share my screen? I'll just get this up now. And make sure you can see everything okay when it eventually comes up. Or is it not coming up?
Not yet.
In a while to feed through. And then again.
While we're just waiting for that, I do want to say we're hoping this to be an interactive discussion. So please feel free to raise your hands and put questions in the chat and we'll monitor them throughout.
Okay, so naturally, the technical expert is the one who has the problem first, as these things are bound to happen. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Great. Let's talk about digital governance. I'm not going to get overly technical. I'll try not to anyway. It tends to be my default. When we talk about data governance, really nothing has changed. Nothing has changed since back in the days when I started work, which was a long time ago. It still is and always will be a case of people, process and policy. So your organisation, the information governance team, whatever title they may have within the organisation, looking at the regulations, looking at the laws, looking at the rules, they develop a process to implement policy, and they want a policy that says this document should not be shared outside the organisation. This document can be shared, but only with these people. And this process has always been there back when we were using packs and so on and so forth. The only difference being now is we have the ability to use technology to implement this policy. We have the ability to get the technology to sit and supervise over the top of this to make sure that the policy that the information governance team has come up with, the laws that we have to adhere to, are applied wherever we're going to use this data. And it's particularly important now because we've moved from from March. It's been a year now. I know it's amazing, but from March last year, we've been running to a realm where our data is everywhere. We can't keep it behind a wall anymore. We can't come to work and sit in the building and this is where we get our data and it all works like that. Our data has to be shared outside the organisation to an extent, certainly outside of our control. So we need to look at ways to protect that data and also to protect the people who want to use that data, to empower those people to use that data, because this is what this is all about. It's not a security thing or a technical thing. It's about empowering the people who are doing the job to do their job and making it easier for them and more productive for them to be able to do that job. Some of the challenges we've got and why we look at it, if we look at the traditional collaboration methods, where particularly in this environment, where you would have, for example, the social worker collaborates with a colleague in the NHS and one will create case notes and it goes through an amendment cycle and it goes to the collaborator and it goes round and round and changes happen. Now, at the beginning, when that document is created or that email chain or whatever it may be is created, it may be not sensitive. It may be that there is no requirement to have particular controls over that document because they're just introducing themselves, they're saying hello. But as that chain progresses, things can happen to that email or to that document that makes it sensitive. Addresses, for example, can be put on there, names, medical information. And at what point is that data meant to be encrypted? Because it should be encrypted when it's got that type of data on it. Now, can we expect our users to say, maybe right at the beginning, I'm going to talk about something sensitive, I should make this sensitive data, but in their day-to-day jobs, not really. It's not really fair to expect them to do that. And if we don't do it, there's a risk of either bad actors stealing that data and using that data, but actually what is much more likely is an accidental leak. It happens quite regularly. The vast majority of data leakage are about people who are just trying to do their job and they accidentally email it to the wrong person, or they accidentally print it when they shouldn't, or share it as when they shouldn't. And this leads to an awful lot of problems, particularly when we're talking about this data. Yes, we can talk about fines and news reports and loss of reputation, but we can do actual harm to the people we're trying to help and the people we're trying to protect. So this is what we're trying to address. It works the same way with modern forms of collaboration. We might be using Teams, we might be using SharePoint. We work on a single source of truth at this point. It's just one document, it sits in one place. We can access that document from various locations, but it's a single source of truth. Same policy though, if we lose a device, if we inadvertently give the wrong people access to it, the same output that can come through that. So we need to look at how we can protect this data and how we can protect it really using the policies that we've come up with and in an easier way, in a way that doesn't involve our users having to learn how to work in different modes and do different things and work in different ways, because at the end of the day, they just want to do their job. So we take that policy and what we do, first off, we look at the data. How do we classify the data? What do we mean? What is classified data? Well, is it social services? Does the document have names on it? Does it have addresses on it? If it's got addresses on it, then maybe we want to make it sensitive. But how many addresses? Maybe one postcode, not a problem. But if it has 2 or 3 or 4 postcodes or unaddresses, then that's changed the document. That's different. That has changed. We need to protect it more then. And once we get that and we get the classification, what we do is we label it. We literally apply an electronic label to that document, okay, that says, big stamp, this is now sensitive data. And in doing that with the label, if it's classified as sensitive data, the organisation, through their team, have created a policy that says, if it's sensitive data, we mustn't do this and we mustn't do that. 2 types of label we've got. I'm not going to talk about retention. That speaks for itself. You know, how long we keep it before we can get rid of it and so on. But a sensitivity label, and we can have numerous different types: child services, probationary, you know, you can think financial, addresses. You can think of anything you like. You can create your own labels. And these labels stay with the document wherever that document goes. This is really important to state here. It doesn't matter if that document is on premise. It doesn't matter if it's in the cloud. It doesn't matter if it's on your computer or if it's on a USB stick. that sensitivity label stays with that document. So if that sensitivity label says this is child services and only the people in child services can open it and read it, when I go to open that document, if I'm not in child services and I can't, my identity says I'm not in child services, I won't be able to open it. I won't be able to do anything with it. If it says child services can open it and read it, but they can't print it, they can't copy from it, they can't copy and paste into another document, they can't email it to anybody outside the organisation. Again, stays with the label, stays with the document. It gives that level of, we call it data loss prevention. It gives that level of protection wherever that document may be and whomever is using that document. So if we go back to what I was talking about before, how can this help before the type of things we go in a modern world? This case, we go back to it. The user creates the case notes. Yes, it goes through the amendment cycle, same as before, back and forth in an email. At some point in that email, and we'll use the, and you'll see why as we come on, we'll use the address type of thing. There was no requirement to classify that document when it started. It had one address on it, and that's not a problem. And it had somebody's address on it, one address. But as it's going back and forth in the cycle, other addresses have added to it. So it becomes more than one, it becomes 2 or 3. And this then triggers a policy that says this is now sensitive information. It may have medical information on it, or it may have probationary reports, or whatever we've set in the system. But as it changes, the system's constantly looking at it and says, that's no longer unclassified, that's now sensitive information. As such, I will encrypt that information and the data is now protected. That's without the user having to do anything, without the user knowing that it's happened, other than when they accidentally try and send it to the wrong person, the system will say, no, you can't do that. This is sensitive information. Yes.
I think Helen's got her hand up. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
go on, Helen.
I was just waiting for you to finish because you were in full flow, but and it's really interesting. My question is, are you describing what should happen, or are you describing what generally is happening out there at the moment?
This is generally what's happening out there at the moment. So organisations across the board, from commercial organisations to public sector to local government to central government, this is the tools we can implement to prevent these accidental links. Okay. This is happening at the moment.
So this is what our partners, local authority partners, will be well used to and is happening now. Is that's fair to say?
I think it would be fair to say that every local authority is on a journey. They're on some are fully implemented this. Some are working on implementing this. For some of them, it's a big task. There are tools to do it. I don't want to go down the technical route about doing this, but if you think, certainly one local government in the UK has got 99 million files. It's a task to implement this. We have automated ways of doing it, some of the automation I'm talking about it. But yes, the local governments in the UK, there are, and if I'm hand on heart, honestly, there are 1 or 2 who haven't started the journey yet. But the vast majority of them are somewhere on the journey to implementing this.
It would be really nice just to hear if anybody on the call has got any feedback on that. Is it happening in your organisation? Does anyone recognise that this is happening or not happening?
Or of course, the end goal should be that this should be happening without the end user being aware. So it may well be happening in an organisation without people being aware of it. That's
well, in which case, can I just, sorry to just press this, I just want to get some feedback from the guys around on the call, because Simon, I forget your surname, Simon, who's from North York, and I wrote down that you were the IT lead. Is it all right if I just ask you that question? Is this something that you already do?
You can ask, but in all honesty, I can't answer. I'm not entirely sure at this point.
Okay. Well, it's just I'm just curious to know if any other bits of feedback now.
Yeah, Helen, I'm not aware in terms of North Yorkshire. We'll have a look. We'll find out. But I think it's quite an interesting point. Actually, I'm not aware.
Yeah, that's what was going through my mind. It's curious, isn't it? But
yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
That's fine. Again, the same policy works in the modern environment when we're using SharePoint, when we're using Teams. It's possible to do the same in chat with Teams as well. So rather than just a document, you're in a chat, you're talking about something, you mention a subject, you mention a keyword, you put a national health number in there, or a password, or financial data, or whatever it may be. And the same type of thing would happen in that we would see that the data you're dealing with is sensitive. We've created an environment that recognizes sensitive data and will automatically apply the type of policies that we want to protect it from. The reasons being the drivers, as you can imagine at this, I've blanked out that this is public knowledge. It's obviously on the BBC site, but it happened to a local council that sent out a list of disabled children and their addresses, their home addresses, and every disabled child who was on the books, and it sent it to every parent. Now this, we call it a data breach, and it almost sounds sometimes like it's a deliberate act of wanton destruction. And it's quite obvious to me that this was literally somebody wanting to do the job to the best of their ability, and made a mistake. And instead of sending the address to the list of addresses to one person, what they actually did was send the list of addresses to every person that was on the list of that addresses. So every family within this local government authority then knew the address of everybody who had a disabled child. Now, where this would stop that is when the user created that document and went to go outside the organisation. The data loss prevention would say this has got sensitive information on it. You should not be sending it outside the organisation. It's not about catching people. It's not about punishing people. It's about taking away some of the risk, a lot of the risk, and it's about empowering people to be able to work and just reminding them that there are these things and these securities they need to do. And at the same time, helping your organisation change. So because everything's monitored, once you label these things, you know where they are, you know where they're going. If there's a large number of people within your organisation that have been trying to share data with another organisation and we've blocked it, maybe there's a requirement to share it with that organisation. Maybe we should look at putting in a B2B, a business to business, a tool set so we can share data with that organisation, because we see from the statistics that lots of people want to. So let's empower them. Let's let's change our organisation to allow them to work better. That is a very, very top level 5 mile high overview of information governance and what we can do. There's obviously different ways of doing it and so on. Are there any questions coming out of that from what I've said? I'm quite happy, Helen, to get some local governments to talk to you about how they are implementing it. I obviously have to go to them first and ask permission, but I'm sure they would. I'm very sure they would talk to you about that. But I'm happy to arrange that if you'd like me to do so.
Could I just ask a question?
Of course.
Which is, so where do you see the biggest barrier sitting?
What do you mean by the biggest barrier?
Well, I mean, what you're describing, I kind of hear as saying, you know, we are able to put these controls in place. We are able to navigate this data governance structure. And therefore, I just wondered whether you have a sense on where, as it were, therefore, the biggest challenges in realising it lie.
So from experience, to me, the biggest challenge and the hardest work is actually done with the information governance team, creating that policy. We've got such good tools, and I would say that I work for Microsoft, I know, but we've got such good tools that actually implementing the policies is not particularly complicated. You know, it tends to be a wizard and next, but we need people to tell us what does child services data look like? We're technical people, we don't know. What does probation documents look like? There are tools that you point to a folder and say, that's what it looks like, go away and learn it. And it will go away and learn, machine learning, what that document looks like. But the hard work to me, being a technical person, is actually not the technical role. It's the information governance team sitting down and saying, if you create a document in child services, it should only be shared with child services and the executive and maybe this 2 or 3 people in this department or whatever that may be. And that, I think, is the challenge. You know, they always say the planning, it's all in the planning before the execution. And I think that's the challenge for organisations, to ask or demand what they want. Demand what they insist should be implemented, and then leave it to the technical teams to do it.
It doesn't. I mean, it seems like there's not a massive amount of awareness of where each local authority is at anyway at the moment. So it might be that it's really helpful to understand this, but for many people, it might be a case of going back and finding out where things stand in their organisation.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'm more than happy to have that conversation with anyone on the call. If you'd like me to have the chat with your organisation to look where they are with teams, I know the people who implement this around the country. And of course, I'm happy to do that as well as to where you stand.
Perfect. In which case, Chris, what we'll do, we'll take that as an action at the end to see if there is any appetite amongst partners to take you up on that very generous offer.
Of course. Thank you. And I'll hand it over to the next speaker, if that's okay.
Sorry, just before we go to Richard, Emran and Joe seem to be typing. Is there something you wanted to ask or comment on before Chris goes?
No, I think from a Redbridge perspective, I mean, it's useful listening to Chris and Chris talking about, you know, we as an authority, we went through that transition from paper-based files to digitized files, documents and document labeling, retention, all of the policies then revamped as a result of that. And I suppose the bit I was in the middle of writing War and Peace in the chat a second ago, but thank you for rescuing me. But there's this, the challenge for us now is about how we present that information to the users, to the individuals, the people who own the data. You know, there is some challenges within our own area at Redbridge where we have our senior teams across children and families and adult social care, which is there is mini industries that we set up in our back offices which deal with subject access requests for information. It's how do we now present that information in a safe and accessible format to the end user, the person whose data it is that we hold. That's a big conversation for us at the moment, and really thinking about the platforms and the information governance that's wrapped around that. The current policies, you know, that is obviously something we'd need to review, but you know, there are some big questions for us as an organisation that if this is the direction of travel, we want it to be that way. That's accessible. So there's this, you know, what in the way of platform do we create? How do we create that platform? And what are the kind of challenges and that we're gonna face from an information governance perspective as we move forward? The technical is not presenting information is not the challenge. It's really down to the information governance as to what we can actually present to the end user.
So it's a conversation I often had. What I'm going to say is you should never put a technical person at the start of a conference because they will steal all your time. I'm going to try not to do it. Emran, please reach out to me afterwards because this is a conversation I have all the time. This is my daily job. How do you implement it? How do you get users used to it? How do you get them to understand what it is? And we talk about crawl, walk, run in an organisation to start slowly and build up and get them used to it in different ways. More than happy to have that conversation with you and your team outside of this, so I'm not hijacking. Please reach out to me and we can go through and I'll give you some top tips for rolling it out.
Yeah, Chris, I think as well though in this sector, and colleagues will tell me if I'm wrong, but as an end user of the adoption system, for example, if I wanted to see the data that was held on me, what would start to become very important was how those case notes are recorded and the language that's used. And for young people that come through the care system, that have a right to see their case notes and their history, that is actually quite an important and skillful task, how to record it in such a way.
Yeah, and we have, again, we're shifting into it differently. I'm so sorry, everybody.
Yeah.
We can talk about data subject requests, advanced e-discovery, how we pull it. So if someone comes in, I've got a right to see my data. I've also got a right to be forgotten. I want to see all the data you've got on me. How do you then, because this is labelled and we've got ways of searching and pulling it out and gathering this data, redacting it before we give it to them if there's other things on, minimising the set, reducing duplicates, handing it over to the person and say, this is all the data we hold on you. There are tools to do that within all this electronic data, and really good tools, but I haven't got the time to talk about them now. Happy to talk outside.
So sounds like we need a bit of a further follow-up on that, Chris, to give you the space to expand on this a bit more. Is that be helpful, Helen? And
I'm just looking at the comments. Mel, did you want to add to that, Mel?
Well, I think that is an absolute key point, and one of the areas that I wanted to pick up on in relation to children's files and how we share information, which I could see being, one of the focus that we have within the lab days, but it doesn't really sit under any of the 4 headings that we've got really. So I think it's really key when we're thinking about that journey for the child, and then understanding that in a way that they're able to. They're horrible, aren't they? Those files, when they're redacted, they make no sense. Half of it's blacked out. It's just really not okay to be sharing this information in this way for children, young people and adults when the time is ready. So I would like to see some work being done on that moving forward. But it doesn't quite sit, does it, actually, under the other headings?
No,
so
but I've loved it now.
Really.
I've got it.
Okay.
Or David? David?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that, it's a real challenge for us in terms of redacting, but, always a young person should be able to come into the office and should have someone with them going through their files and explaining why there is redaction, on their files, etc. I'm not sure really what the way around that is, because there's certainly information on their files that is third party that they wouldn't be privy to, except it is their file. It goes back to social work training, and we have these conversations a lot, and I have done all my career with social workers about really writing that file as if you were the child that was going to come back and read it, and what would it look like for you, so that's about a training thing. Just one other point on the whole sort of digitalization is it's fantastic and very, very exciting, but I work in a so-called reasonably affluent borough, but we still have very, very many pockets within what is London's geographically largest borough of what we call sort of digital poverty. So we have lots of service users, children, families that don't have laptops, computers, Wi-Fi at home, etc., etc. So it's just bearing in mind that we, whilst moving forward, there would always be cohorts that are marginalised by progress, if you like, and that there will always be. And I think especially currently, we're in an age where those margins are growing even wider, if you like. So it's just bearing that in mind, really, because there will always be many of our customers, if you like, that won't be up to speed digitally, really. And we just have to hang on to some of the, if you like, the old-fashioned ways of communicating. So although we still have lots of families, of course, like everyone, that will email us daily and so on, we have lots that just can't do that. And our care leavers also actually can fall into that cohort the older they become.
Yeah, no, good point. Ian has the hand up as well.
Yeah, we have AI now that can run scripts and have conversations with people for half an hour or so when you wouldn't know it was an AI. Surely the technology and potential is there for caseworkers, for case files to be written through an AI to be more user friendly or plain English, or You know, we're trying in Havering to stop the word placement and provision, and to make it language which we'd want to hear ourselves if we read our case files back later on. You know, it's a scope for technological intervention in terms of translating some of the jargon, do you think?
Well, I think that's a great idea. Microsoft colleagues, what do you think?
Yeah, the answer is sorry, yes, of course. I mean, if you go at the very basic fundamentals and talk about the ability to dictate and have case notes typed up, you know, we're not all brilliant typists, and some of us have accessibility challenges around that anyway. But the ability to dictate notes allows you to talk more in a more natural way than trying to shorten what you're having to do, than having to shorten the notes. The use of bots. Absolutely, and I know we're going to go on to AI, so I'm not going to talk about that bit either. But the use of bots is available through that as well. But more and more, we're looking at not just having the technology, but having the ability to use the technology in an easier way implemented throughout organisations.
Really pleased that there's so much engagement and discussion on this, and thank you so much, Chris, for facilitating some of these comments. Can I suggest, Helen, that we just do a quick move on to some of the responsible AI discussion, and we could wrap up?
Sorry, let me just bring Lee in. Yeah.
Just got my hand up.
Oh, sorry, Lee, I didn't see. Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay, Kenya. I'm fascinated by this rich conversation around use of artificial intelligence, all the things that are there. But I just think there's a bit for me, which is, and a colleague mentioned this in the call, so my apologies for not remembering the colleague's name. We've got to be really mindful about sloppy practice. And you know, poor recording. So while the tools that we can use will be really a step change, we do need to be influencing social work education, HEIs around, you know, good practice, recording, etc. is really important. But I do welcome the conversations about use of digital dictaphone. Just before I left my previous authority, we'd engage with the What Work Centre under their Happier, Healthier Social Workers. Not the best title, I think, but it certainly was. It wasn't coffee machines. Around them providing a digital solution, which basically an app on their smartphone where they could use digital recording from home visits, and so that was being evaluated. So I'm waiting to see that. But I think there's a real opportunity, Chris, and I'm fascinated by these bots. But let's just remember, you know, social work is a relational, humane space, isn't it? You know, let's not get too carried away with what robots can do for us. But hey, that's me on my soapbox.
Great. Thank you, Lee. Thanks. Good reminder. Kenya, did you want to carry on?
I'm going to hand over to Richard now, but thank you for all the comments, guys. And I do suggest we kind of circle back with Chris and do a bit more detailed Q&A on some of the data governance stuff. But Richard, over to you.
Thank you. I mean, I think that last bit of the conversation was a really good segue into where we're going to go to next with this, because we're going to talk about AI, and we're going to acknowledge the great power that exists in the technology, but we're going to explore how we can do that responsibly. I was telling the story the other day about a shopping encounter that I'd had in our Microsoft campus back in the days when we went to such things, when we went to offices, and I was sitting in the open plan upstairs across the desk from a colleague who had been entertaining the office for several months about the sale of her house. And on this Tuesday afternoon, she successfully closed the deal, and very audibly to the rest of the open plan, we heard her do the deal with the estate agent. And I thought very nobly at the time that I would just nip downstairs to the little co-op concession that we have on our campus in Reading. And I went over to the fridge and I pulled out a small bottle of Prosecco, and I took the bottle of Prosecco over to one of the 6 self-checkout terminals that we have in that store, and I scanned it successfully into my basket. At the same time that I did that, literally at the same time, there was a young guy who brought a bottle of beer out of the fridge to take home with him for his supper, and he scanned it into the kiosk next to me. And whilst he scanned his in, he got an audible, very loud announcement to say that a member of the store staff would be over to approve that item going into his basket. And it was at that time that I recalled a conversation that I'd had with Martin, who runs our co-op concession in Reading, a couple of weeks earlier, about the fact that we were running an experiment in the store that used the CCTV camera in the ceiling to track the age of people who were checking out alcohol products in our store. And the unsettling thing, the most unsettling thing for me in that experience was that I recalled that Martin had very generously set the age threshold on the computer vision model that was running at the generous age of 35. And clearly I hadn't troubled that algorithm in any shape or form. It's quite a momentary age-defying experience. What it meant for Martin was that he could deliver immense efficiency into that store. He could run the entire store operation from the back of the store off his laptop. He had other cameras that were looking at things like the fresh goods that he was putting in, the muffins that he was putting out from the warming shelves out onto the display. The camera would tell him when he would needed to restock the planogram, when he needed to refresh things from the back of his oven. Incredibly powerful, incredible efficiency, meaning that he could deal with more people face to face. He could get out there and wander around the store and really get to know people. And he remarked on that at the time. But clearly unsettling, not just because I was unsettled about my age definition, but I was wondering where that data was being stored. It's happening on a Microsoft campus. I'm aware that whenever I'm on a Microsoft campus, I'm a little bit of a lab rat as an employee anyway, with most of the experiment. In the background to Chris's talk, my PC melted down because I'm running a very experimental version of Windows at the moment, and I was recovering that. That's my life. But if we're going to start using this kind of technology out there in the wild, we have to be really, really quite confident about how we can use this with great responsibility. So let me share with you some perspectives on this. And there is no conceit. You're not going to get somebody standing up here with great hubris to say that we're Microsoft, we know exactly how to manage through all of the ethics in this. This is a developing body of knowledge every day. It's a developing body of knowledge that exists within a culture, within a society that is different across the world, and we have to be part of the way that we navigate through this. And hopefully what I'll do is I'll give you some examples of techniques and tools that we use within Microsoft that may spur on some thinking for you to think about how you can deliver a responsible approach to AI. So let me put a little caveat up at the beginning. It is, 10 to 5 on a Wednesday afternoon. I'm sorry, folks, but this might get a little bit deep. Well, in fact, no, it's not going to get deep. I'm just using this as a slightly hackneyed way of telling a story about Project Natick, because this is the kind of thing that Microsoft does. It takes, in this case, a pressure vessel, and it fills it full of computing machinery, and it throws this pressure vessel off the side of a ship into the North Atlantic off the coast of Scotland. And what we're doing here is we're experimenting how we can use the cooling properties of the ocean to reduce the CO2 impact of the air conditioners that we would otherwise need to cool the data centers that we run around the planet. This is how we roll in Microsoft. It happens every day in this kind of company that I work within. But hey, while we do it, naturally, we stick a video camera on the outside of the pressure vessel and we point that camera into the ocean, and that camera very cleverly discerns from the shimmery, shiny objects that are swimming past the camera lens how many fish are there. And in this case, we actually connected up to a local marine biology project, and we're using them to make some nominal assessment of fish stocks very locally around our data center. There's something in the frivolous way with which we do this that should be a little bit unsettling, because all this is a waterproof camera that has a direct connection up to the internet, up to the cloud. All of the computing power, the clever interpretation that's happening here is happening in the cloud. It happens readily. It happens through a connection that we use in our daily lives. Anytime we use some AI on our smartphones, anytime that we're getting a recommendation for the next movie that we watch on Netflix or whatever, all of these processes are happening incredibly easily, incredibly frivolously up on the cloud. And the access to that power is phenomenal. I use exactly the same image in my normal day job when I'm having conversations with big retail customers, and this is exactly the same piece of technology being used in M&S. It's a camera that is understanding what's happening in the store. It's identifying, in this case, that there's a spillage. It's dispatching somebody from the back to clean up this spillage. And it's also informing the supply chain that the products need to be restocked and refurnished and replenished inside it. This is the grown-up version of the version that Martin is running inside the Reading store. But it is a camera making sense of things in a very public space, and we have to be really, really quite careful about how we navigate through this. Oh, we go again. Other examples that I encounter in my role as AI ethics lead are even more unsettling. In any public services situation, such as your own, one of your biggest challenges is how you distribute resources, scarce resources, to a demanding set of citizens. How do you decide who gets those services when you've only got so many to go around? This is an example of a probation service in the UK that wanted to use an algorithm to decide which of their ex-offenders would receive certain educational packages based on their likelihood to reoffend. It's a very worthy pursuit of a machine learning model. Surely we can look at all of the historic data about who's received these services and then determine who best we should be distributing these services going forwards. Great value, but something that needs a considerable amount of thought. Advertisers are seeking to use camera technology in public spaces to make sure that when we're standing in front of big billboards like this one in Piccadilly Circus, when we eventually get out there and start mingling with the world, that we're being served with adverts that fit our demographic. That certain times of the day, certain people might gather. It might make more sense to show them certain images according to their ages, their movement patterns, whether they're lingering, whether they're staying, whether they're moving rapidly through these spaces. Surely we could use a camera to make sense of those human objects that are moving in that space. Incredible value in that, but equally, where is the data going? What are people tracking about me at those points in time? Some of the use cases that we look at have real material, immediate consequence for individuals. One of the projects that I've been involved in is how to use AI within the cabs of fast-moving heavy vehicles, such as oil tankers. How do we determine whether an individual is being distracted or falling asleep or needs a specific form of training or intervention to make them a better driver? These are things that have life-saving results, life-saving consequences, but equally they could be career limiting. If managers got hold of some of the information of these individuals going about their daily jobs, would that really have a long-term impact on this individual's ability to earn a living? So the use cases that we're thinking about here are very complex and very broad, and we have to have an ability to answer some really quite difficult questions in this space, and here's some that certainly I encounter as I navigate through life, and as you increasingly rely on tools like AI, as you surely will, you need to build the ability to be able to navigate through these questions if you want to harness the great power and innovation that sits inside it. So let's unpack the way that we think it through from a Microsoft point of view. This is Satya Nadella. This is my boss. This is our boss. He is our leader, And the distinctive thing about this chap is that he communicates with us relentlessly, not so much about technology, even though he is one of the biggest geeks you'll ever meet. He communicates with us about our values as an organization. And that is incredibly powerful, incredibly motivational as an employee within any organization. But it's also incredibly helpful when we start to navigate really difficult topics like AI. When you navigate the ethics around the use of this kind of technology, you're always looking upwards for some form of provenance, some axiomatic norm that you can go back to so that you can think through your working. So why would we do that and not that? What ultimately is the reference point at which we can decide why we're doing something, and probably also really importantly, explain why we're doing something and understand why we're doing something at that point in time. One of the most important start points for you to think about your journey through the responsible use of AI is to be able to understand what your values are. Your values are as an organization and the values that you represent in the society within which you work. How can you explain and understand the basis of all of your decisions without defining what those values are? So as we walk through this as an organization, one of the other interesting things that we noticed from a Microsoft point of view was that our instincts to try and solve this kind of problem through engineering were tempered by a realization that we needed to equip ourselves with a really diverse set of thinking. So naturally, Microsoft would love to solve a problem like AI ethics by developing some code, developing a program that'll enable us to make those decisions for us. But in fact, we ended up doing things like write books about this, because these are not algorithmic decisions. These are decisions that need cogitation and consideration and a diverse thinking around it. We employ lots of anthropologists, sociologists, philosophers inside our organization as a result of our journey through AI ethics, because we need to have a way of really understanding some of these very, very knotty problems. So the practice that we use within Microsoft is built on a kind of a pyramid, and I'm not saying that the contents of our pyramid are necessarily the only way of doing this, but they may be a useful way for you to think through your own journey in using this kind of technology. Underneath everything are the values that we've talked about earlier, but we distilled those values into 6 principles in Microsoft. Everything that we decide from an AI point of view has got these 6 principles underneath it. These are our principles. You may find your own principles that relate to your world. And these principles, it's really important for us, are very public. Whatever the principles are, we want to engage our market, our constituency, the users of our technology in these principles. So we go to great lengths to publish these principles, and here they are front and center on our website, and you can go onto the website and read what the detail is behind each of these 6 principles. But they sit there very public facing so that we can have an open and transparent conversation with our market, but those principles then have to be inculcated into the way that we work within Microsoft. And we do that through our practices. So on top of the principles, we infuse effectively into all of the processes that we have in our organization, a way of relating those principles to the way that we work. And they typically manifest themselves in terms of guidelines. Those guidelines begin quite specific. They relate to specific use cases that we want to think through. But you'll find as you develop more and more of these use cases, as you use more and more of these solutions in this space, you'll be able to reuse guidelines, and they'll become increasingly more generic and more referenceable in that space. So here are some of the examples of some of the guidelines that reflect those principles in the way that we think through. One of them here is this: these are design cards that we use within our solution definition. I've actually got a copy here, which I keep with me. So when I'm running design workshops with my customers to develop new solutions, I have this deck of cards here, which prompt various points in the design for me to think through some of the ethical questions associated with the features that I'm using. I have other things over here as well. These are things I collect. This is a pack of cards for a game called Judgment Call, and it is a game around our 6 principles that we use at the beginning of our sessions to get people to understand a little bit more about what those principles are and perhaps how they might relate to the use cases that we're looking at in those solutions. All that's happening here is that we're infusing those principles into the way that we work. We mentioned bots earlier. We have a wizard for when we're defining what we do with bots. And here's one of the ways that we are very transparent. If we refer back to the transparency principle in the way that we define bots, we have an obligation whenever we make a bot in Microsoft that we have to be very clear to the person that's using that bot that it is a bot and not a human being. That's one of the principles that we reflect. Some of these principles are really concrete, but I also wanted to show to you this principle here. This is a principle around facial technology, and facial recognition technology is very, very sensitive at the moment. So we're less able to be explicit and concrete around this particular guideline. We have to be much more conversational about the way that we deal with this kind of subject. And that's okay. We're reconciled with that. We're quite comfortable with that because technologies like facial recognition are very, very embedded in the way that our own societies are navigating through this space. So our guidelines in this kind of area end up looking much more conversational, much more let's engage the community that we're working with. And in this case, I put up a couple of blogs. This is Microsoft reaching out to the world, trying to say, well, this is the way that we're thinking through our facial recognition technology. We're going to share with you everything that we know about this. We haven't quite nailed it. We're not going to commit ourselves necessarily at this point in time to all of the detail, but we want your views and thoughts in it so that we can factor those into the way that we're thinking. And I'm showing you these different types of guidelines to show that some of the guidelines you can be really quite confident and prescriptive about, but others you might just want to be really quite slow and quite developed and conversational in the way that you're negotiating your use of this technology with your community. So when we've got those practices that express the principles into the way that we work, none of this would be meaningful unless we can actually evidence what those practices are. So it's all very well for you to have little tick boxes and bits of policy that say that when we do this kind of solution, you must do this, you must follow these guidelines and everything like that. It's all very well saying that, but if you can't evidence whether you've done that, you aren't really following all the way through to the end. And the tools bit of what we do is the bit where we're putting telemetry and measurement into the processes that we're using to understand, to protect, and to control the flow of data in our systems. And here's a bunch of tools that we've actually ended up developing most of these tools inside Microsoft so that we can actually think through and evidence lots of the practices that we're using. These are our tools. These are the tools of a big tech company that's doing incredibly sophisticated things with technology. But it begs a question of what would your tooling be? How would you evidence, even if you've gone through a successful responsible AI design process for one of your solutions, how would you evidence whether it is continually to be responsible, that it's continuously being ethical and transparent in the way that it's delivering its services? It's a little pointer there for you to keep thinking through how you're going to evidence it. And then all of that is governed, all of that is managed, all of that is directed and thought about and supervised within the organization. And we have a simple structure within Microsoft that has ownership of all of these different elements. The responsible AI officer has a single person that sits right at the very top of our organization, underneath Satya's board, that owns everything in this space. And she is able to cascade all of that responsibility down to folk like me that deal with the very front line of all of these AI challenges. This works for us. This is something that maps to our organization. But you will need to have very clear forms of governance inside your own organization to be able to confidently apply some of these practices that we've talked about. This is what our top level committee looks like in Microsoft. It's affectionately known as the Ether Committee, which is a horrendous haranguing of an acronym using ethics and engineering and research all whacked in together. But you can see on this diagram here, certainly the span of attention that Microsoft has in terms of its interest in AI ethics. And that shouldn't do anything more for you really than just to encourage you to think really broadly about this space. And with that, I thought I'd just leave you with 3 really important things to think through in this. What you've just seen is Microsoft's take on what responsible AI is. We live and breathe it. It's a huge part of our business model as an organization. It's incredibly complex and industrialized. But if you were to strip it down to 3 things to really pay attention to inside your own organizations, firstly, recognize the power and the intelligence that sits inside this technology. This technology is incredibly powerful, but that intelligence is really, really limited in its rationality. It is a rational form of intelligence. It's incredibly powerful at doing singly automated things really, really well. It's very narrow, it's very rational, it doesn't do things particularly creatively at all. And it's only by harnessing that rational intelligence with that beautiful, irrational, entrepreneurial ingenuity of human beings that you ultimately are able to extract the value. And that complementarity between the technology and the human beings is always going to be part of the way that you're going to deliver value in this space. So think about not how this intelligence is going to deliver value on its own, but think about how it's going to deliver value alongside the human beings, the social workers that are on the front line that are going to deliver all of the great care and empathy in those experiences. And the final bit is actually a little bit of an odd way of just putting a third I in the acronym here, but it's a really, really important thing as your watchword for responsibility. Your best mitigator against dysfunction and bias and irresponsibility in your use of AI is always going to be an inclusive organization. If all of your AI solutions are developed by grey-haired, white, middle-class blokes, they're all going to be tailored towards that kind of experience. You need to build as much diversity and inclusivity in the way that you're building these solutions, that you're second guessing the features and the impacts and everything that you want to do with this technology. And you want to have as rich and as diverse and inclusive conversation with your citizens that you're serving around its use and its unsettlingness in that space. If you can be as inclusive as you possibly can in this space, you are more than likely to mitigate against the bigger problems associated with this great, powerful technology. So there we go. It is a bit of a deep subject and it's an expansive subject, but hopefully what I've given you in that space there is some things to think about in your journey through the use of AI.
Thank you very much, Richard. That was, I mean, absolutely fascinating, and I can't pretend that I understood everything that you said, but I'm trying hard to relate it to how we might deploy AI in children's social care, and others may have thoughts and ideas already that are springing to mind, because it's obviously a lot. It should, you know, we're not being experts in the development of AI means that we won't have quite a sophisticated set of systems and policies, but others may have already given this some thought.
So if I could maybe illustrate a use case that would be relevant for children's services, would that help to kind of spark some thinking? So one of the scenarios that Richard outlined was around kind of that kind of prevention and target interventions. So imagine if you were trying to work out who is most likely to be a victim of child abuse or a victim of domestic violence, for example, and based on those predictions, they were to receive a targeted package of care. Now, in principle, that's a really good thing because you want to make sure that you are making the best use of limited resources and you're targeting resources where they're needed most. But I guess what we're trying to say is you need to think about the principles to make sure that those decisions, that AI-infused decision is fair, that it's reliable, that it's inclusive, and it doesn't inadvertently disadvantage any particular service user group.
Ian.
Yeah, just to share something that we've tried in Havering, and I get confused between AI and predictive analytics a little bit, in that what we're trying to do here, are we trying to bring in technology that will support decision making and pathways, or are we trying to learn from the information that we hold to enable humans to make decisions and help and have the system maybe force them into making a decision when maybe they're looking the other way? We looked at Los Angeles and the Child Protection Service in Los Angeles, which holds probably more data than all of London combined. And I saw a presentation, I can't remember the name of the guy, but he basically had a whiteboard, and on the whiteboard, on any one day, you can press a button and it will tell him the top 3 families that he should be concerned about, based on the wealth of data that they get, because they get data from the police as well as the probation services and hospitals. So they'll know from all that data events that have happened in families which have made them top of their RAG list. We don't have the same data to share. We have bits of data. And what we did in Havering, we took all the data for 3 years of every word written about all the children in our care, and we gave it to some people with very big brains to see if there was anything in the data. We then told them what the destination was for children, whether it was in care or what their journey would be, whether they were in care already, whether placement breakdown and the like. And they couldn't really draw much more than a 5% correlation about the data that we held and the eventual outcomes based on all the journey of all these children, of like 700 or 800 children that we gave them. So it kind of left us scratching our heads a little bit as to think how we could best use the data that we've got from a predictive perspective, which then draws us onto an artificial intelligence perspective. And what I was saying earlier about, the simple bot rewriting something into plain English versus how we can use everything we've got about families to enable us to then make decisions with them and on their behalf. So I don't know, a comment rather than a question, but that.
Yeah. I mean, Ian, if I just pick up this thing about where does predictive analytics end and AI starts, I think there is much of AI that is predictive analytics, and there is much of predictive analytics that is AI. So I think anything where you are trying to use technology to data to inform decisions at a point at which it's difficult for the human being to automatically see the correlations themselves, that is the point at which you will be looking to consider this kind of level of responsible use, because it's at that point that you're potentially introducing bias and dysfunction into it, and much of that bias and dysfunction is there already in the training data sets that were used for that prediction. Much of that dysfunction doesn't necessarily happen at the point at which you make a decision. One of the big challenges at the moment is if you look at lots of the data sets in the world, they tend to have been gained from low-hanging fruit and they tend to be driven by data that sits inside a predominantly affluent, middle class, male, white environment, whether that's visual data or shopping data or transport data or design data associated with vehicles and things like that. It's a really narrow demographic from which that model has been trained. And having that awareness of the fact that that bias and dysfunction might sit in there has to be a huge part of, if you like, the risk management associated with the reliance on that model as a decision. And that's what this is. This is a field of risk management, of understanding that in every time you rely on a decision that comes from this kind of technology, there is a risk. How can you mitigate against that risk in terms of the way that you build and use the model?
Carol?
Yeah, I just wanted to come in actually between those 2 points, because Ian, I'm very interested in what you said about the fact that you were trying to find the predictive data. And I wanted to share an example of a piece of work I did in a different realm, where we were looking at young people's business start. And we found that the correlation of success was with whether they held a driver's license. So sometimes you actually need to look for a different type of correlative information. It also, of course, that is a question which it is acceptable to ask a young person, as opposed to saying, well, exactly how many times have you been picked up by the police on the street? Have you got a driver's license is a fairly neutral kind of question, but it was one of the factors that went into identifying whether the business loan was likely or less likely to be repaid. So I just thought you might find that interesting, actually, that it didn't come out of the data we collected. It came out of a piece of data that we identified from elsewhere. And I'm really interested in what Richard was saying there about the intersection, and how poor we seem to be in feeding in the statistical evidence of risk, i.e. the chances of something happening, from research.
Yeah.
We're just terrible at it, and it drives me to absolute distraction, particularly in relation to early permanence planning for infants who have been born in drug abusing households. Frankly, what are we waiting to happen? So I do think that it's about the data correlation, not just the inside gubbins of the data we happen to be familiar with collecting.
And Carol, you're absolutely right. And the good news is that the data science tools, and I flashed up a few of the technical tools that we use in Microsoft, the tools are there to identify and understand what's called interpretability in the way that these variables contribute to a decision at the end of the day. That's not a problem for you to be thinking through. The problem for you is to make sure that somebody is thinking about that you have a process within which someone is thinking about that. And that might come through from a design process. It might come through from having a very diverse organization that is going to challenge and ask the right questions at the right time. There is an immense body of knowledge that is available to assist in this, but decisions for you as leaders in this space are more about how do you create an organization and an environment within which those tools and bodies of knowledge are going to be exercised. So that's the context within which we're operating here.
And I know Lee wants to come in as well. Lee, do you want to jump in now?
Lee, was it you or the dog that had the question?
Yeah, no, it was absolutely me. I mean, first of all, Carol, can I just absolutely, we do need to be intervening more quickly with little ones where there are long-term drug addiction and drug abuse as well, but also hang on to the fact that parents can work and with agencies and services move away from a level of addiction. But I know the data tells us and the research picture tells us something different. So just a kind of binary note there. And then my other reflection, Richard, is Does the data tell us anything differently between artificial intelligence technology decision making as opposed to human decision making? What does that tell us? That's not my dog, by the way.
That's mine. That's mine.
You know, what does because that's that interpretive kind of discussion, which I think we're all grappling with around what AI can do versus that human judgment.
I mean as I was trying to point out in that combination between intelligence and ingenuity, the sweet spot is when they both happen together, where you're using them successfully together. I mean, we've heard these stories about how chess games, run in this sort of arms race of a computer beats a human, and then a human then learns through the computer about how to beat the computer. That complementarity that you get when you put a computer and a human together is where the best efficiency is. But that equally introduces the opportunity for dysfunction. Because if you've not got a human being that's able to understand what the computer's saying effectively, you can actually make the system worse. So I often get this question where, someone will come in and say, well, the model here is telling me that they've got an 80% confidence on the recommendation of the next best action to take. And the person goes, oh, well, that's 80% confidence. That's pretty good, isn't it? That's, that's 4 chances in 5 I'm right there, so I'm gonna act on that. Well, in fact, an 80% confidence in a basic machine learning model is shockingly poor. It's absolutely useless. So there has to be some training at some point to say that actually, if you're going to use a computer recommendation engine to inform a decision, then the human being has to know the optimum level of recommendation, let's say in this case, to act on it. You're always going to get a better performance when you're putting the two together, but that requires the education to be able to make use of it.
Yeah, just to add, I mean, when I'm talking about AI generally around social care, I tend to not call it artificial intelligence, I tend to call it assistive intelligence, because I really think that's the role that it should be playing within this sector. It's to support decision making, support practitioners with the data soup that we're all living in, which is getting worse and worse and worse over time as more and more data comes, to support and really help them cope with that volume, as opposed to replacing anything. And I mean, the government has released guidelines on this as well, that certainly you don't want an end-to-end process where the computer is the decision maker. Clearly that's not a good idea here. But can it help you to support your intuition, I suppose? Who really does need help today? I think that's that's the sort of realm that we need to be thinking about.
One example of a project that I've worked on in this space is that we're very comfortable now with voice to text transcription, and in fact you're going to see it. You can already see it in Teams. We could be transcribing this and creating effectively the minutes of this meeting. Very soon you're going to be able to use that AI to understand whether I'm giving somebody an action or I'm making an observation, and and who that action is going to be through. So that kind of technology sits there already. That technology is being tested in things like 999 call centers, where you're trying to understand whether a caller is a vulnerable person from the words that they're using and the context within which they're calling and their associated history. And all of that data is being crunched into an agent that's sitting there in a call center that gets a little flag. That's all they get. They don't get an automated response. They just get a little advisory on the call center machine that says that we think that this person requires an escalation. Now, how does the operator react to that flag at that point in time is the critical point of intervention at that point. You're assisting, as Helena says, but the actual action that's going to convert that information into something worthy and good at the end of the day is the really critical point that's going to augment that human experience effectively.
We're almost at time, but I really am keen to know if there is anybody on the call where you've had experience of deploying or testing AI in children's services in any way, shape, or form. Is there any experience of that here? No.
The nearest I would probably suggest is which is a big policy shift, was the Troubled Families Agenda, which started to think about families that were living in poverty and being overrepresented in a whole range of socio-economic deprivation factors. And with that, so yeah, that's other than that, the nearest I can get to it is the Minority Report, which was 2002, famous Tom Cruise film.
Ian, have you? Ian, have you got an?
No, it's the same. It's the line between how we use data and all those data sets to inform us about particular families versus what's artificial and what's intelligent about it.
Yeah.
That's it's like I said before about trying to look at cause and correlation in existing data and the limits, but I think the trapdoor we always fall down is the extent of data that we've got. I think Barking and Dagenham have been by far the most, I don't know if they're on this network, by far the most in-depth shared data sets that I've seen from the police and the health and the council, which enables them to take decisions based on the data and predictive data. But that doesn't necessarily describe what Richard's described in terms of.
I think the other thing in this, Ian, is to remember in this is that it's very easy to think about AI in these extreme cases that are incredibly difficult and everything. There is a progression to get into it. Today, for instance, I've used Cortana half a dozen times to schedule meetings. I get an email from somebody saying, "Can I meet with you next week?" I just ping Cortana and say, "Cortana, can you set up that meeting for me?" That's a relatively benign automation experience that adds great productivity to me and my environment. Many of the compliance and regulatory aspects of your role can be automated, can benefit from AI relatively readily, whilst you're building the machinery to be able to navigate through all of these ultimately very difficult and complex considerations later. Far better to begin a journey where you're educating yourself and creating some of these complicated constructs that I've talked about today along the way, so that when you get to the point of really wanting to jump in deep, you are equipped and able to navigate through this responsibly.
I do think as a sector that children's services are massively behind the curve on the use of assisted decision-making technology, etc. And I'll just quote the pandemic. How long has Teams and this way of working been around before local authorities and children's trusts wholeheartedly started to implement it, because they had to as part of their reset and recovery position with the pandemic? It's been an absolute game changer in so many ways. So it just made me reflect, and this has been around for several years, doesn't it? I think, Richard.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, definitely COVID has removed myths and broken down barriers in terms of digital transformation generally. But what I think you're going to see really quite quickly is that this experience is going to drive increasing digitization in the periphery that's sitting around us. The fact that you can bring a digital artifact into this experience and put up a dashboard in this experience, and is very quickly going to be starting to digitize what's happening in the periphery around Teams. And then that is going to lead you very quickly into examining what you can do in terms of insights from that digitized experience. But think of it very much as that incremental journey into the difficult challenges that sit in the context of much of what we've been talking about today, and use that as an opportunity to build those three things of intelligence, ingenuity, and inclusivity in what you do, and you'll have more success than you would otherwise.
I just wanted to, can I add one really quick point just to say that I think the other thing is when you're procuring technology solutions, this is the sort of question that you need to be asking them. Is there AI capability within your solution? And actually, what decisions is it supporting me to make? What is it actually doing? Because I know that there are some London boroughs who've looked at using their troubled families data set, I think, and using AI across it to say, who's not quite in the troubled category yet, but who's coming next, which is fine if the data has been gathered in that way. But I think it's very important that we also acknowledge when we are buying things that are imbued with AI. So just so that you can be clear that it meets your ethical standards.
Helene, I'd be intrigued to hear whether regulatory agencies such as Ofsted or other organisations, with the amount of data that they have and the data mining, whether they're using some artificial intelligence, because it surely must be on Ofsted's radar for sure, and CQC and various other.
I would have thought so, and that might be a discussion, I guess, that we could broker with them. But yeah, sure, they're drowning in loads and loads of information. Certainly, I've been in conversations with various regulators who are starting to think, how can we take more of a risk-based approach to who we inspect when we inspect them, and what indicators can we look at to decide who needs to be inspected sooner rather than later? What might those be? So I think it's certainly in the thinking, if not in the practice.
Yeah, thanks, Helen.
Thank you very much, everybody. I think we probably should draw to a close because I don't want to push us too far over time. So if that's okay, I think there's an offer for people to access some Microsoft expertise outside of this in the form of Chris. I think he made an offer to provide advice on, I think it was data loss prevention was what he was suggesting. I would quite like to try and sum up then, and it'd be really good actually, just before I do, I hope today's been useful. It'd be really good to get some feedback about the things that you want to hear more about, and what we can do with these webinars, because there's a wealth of expertise that we are here and able to draw on. So knowing what you'd like to know more about would be really helpful. In summing up then, what I think was clear from the first presentation was we don't really have an understanding on who's doing what when it comes to data loss prevention and who's at what stage, but that sounded like an important thing to know in each individual organisation, and Chris's offer of advice. There was quite a lot, I think, of people were concerned about how data is recorded on young people and whether we should do more through the incubator to think about that problem, whether it's more a skills issue than a technology issue, but nonetheless it's an issue. So coming back to that one potentially. And then on to AI and the food for thought that Richard's presented. I think I won't even attempt to sum anything up other than to say I think there was a consensus that starting small on the regulatory or productivity gains type areas to deploy something like AI is the way to build confidence with it. And when the time comes to elaborate further, again, there's a wealth of expertise available and thankfully through the incubator, on tap. So I think we should probably then close things there. Are there any other points or questions or comments that anyone would like to flag before we go? Carol, is there anything you want to?
Yeah, well, I wanted to thank everybody for such a rich discussion. I think it was summarised at the end there by Richard, which is think of this as steps. You don't have to necessarily be jumping all the way in one bound. And there did seem to me to be a number of areas of investigation and innovation that we could be looking at in the predictive risk arena. And maybe we think together about that early permanence planning arena as one. And there were a number that seemed to be coming out. But I just wanted to give our thanks to our Microsoft colleagues for giving so generously of their time to help us to start to wrap our minds around the broader context and issues for the innovations that we will now embark upon. So I think with that, we thank everybody for joining. Please do send through your thoughts to Helen on future webinars and on link-ups and on project ideas that we should pursue from this stage. And I wish you all a good and sunny evening.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone
for your time and your
Thank you very much.
engagement.
Absolutely.